You did Jeet Kune Do, and
Yes,
you were an instructor as well. It was not
I
just.
was. Yes.
So I'm very much looking at trying to understand what it is that makes martial arts effective and vice versa. And many people are still clinging to some martial arts as effective, and some of them are pretty much done. Like Aikido, very few
Right.
people believe the effectiveness. Mainly Aikido people believe in it. But there's some like Wing Chun and also Jeet Kune Do where people do believe that it's still an effective martial art. Yet, as much as I read into your biography, you became disillusioned by it.
Correct. Yes.
It's also so weird for me because Bruce Lee was all about making things effective, and there's this moment you realizing that there's something lacking in it. So could you tell a
Yes.
bit about that?
Sure. I was drawn to Jeet Kune Do because I was looking for truth. I was looking for truth in martial arts, and I was interested in what works and what doesn't in the context of just fighting. And the idea of Jeet Kune Do, which is a very utilitarian idea, even the motto itself, absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, which is
Right.
something that Bruce Lee had taken from Mao Zedong. But that utilitarian motto is appealed to me. And when I would see the articles written by Dan Inosanto and other people, they talked about fighting at all four ranges. And I'd been in more than a few street fights as a kid where I had been taken down and just put in a headlock and held down and beat up by, wrestlers or
Mm.
just kids that were better on the ground than me. So I knew that I needed that. And I also had my father was always a boxing fan, and I kind of grew up understanding that if you're going to fight with your hands and you're going to punch, then the delivery system is going to be most effective, is going to be boxing based. So from the outside perspective, I was seeing people who were doing boxing. And when Bruce Lee incorporated boxing in the movies, that was, of course, way ahead of his time because up to that point, it had been, as you know, mostly Chinese opera.
Right.
And so they had the boxing and they had the idea of needing to be able to fight at all ranges and fight on the ground. And they had the idea of having form follow function as opposed to the other way around, all of which I
Right.
found appealing. What I discovered after becoming an instructor and doing it for a number of years is because their epistemology was lacking, that they had gone off track. And in addition to that, I just ran into a whole bunch of hypocrisy, which really bothered me. So they would,
Right.
if you remember back in the day, Dan Inosanto had a book called Absorb What Is Useful, and it was filled with photographs actually with the Paul Vunak, and there was some other of the original Kali Academy instructors in there. And they'd have side-by-side comparisons of Shotokan karate stance and punches in comparison to Western boxing. And I think that was good. And I think that's educational. And that's the kind of thing you would do in any other field of human knowledge or any other science where we want to expand on what our ancestors had done and build the knowledge for the next generation. So I found that good. But the problem I discovered in Jeet Kune Do is where they had that. And then at the same time, they're adopting something like Penjak Silat, which was, if anything, even more ridiculous than Shotokan. And there
Mm.
was a disconnect there
Right.
because they had a certain affection for Southeast Asian martial arts, or whatever the reasoning was, they weren't congruent with their own line of thinking. So that ultimately led to different philosophy from the other instructor that I was partnered with, and that's what prompted me initially to open up my first school, my own school.
In terms of Jeet Kune Do, I just recently heard, I haven't seen it yet myself, that you created a functionalized version of it. And
No,
no?
um, what that was when I first came out with my first set of videos,
Yeah.
and I believe this was 1996, 97. I think it was about
Mhm.
1996 when they first came
Mm.
out, and I titled them Functional Jeet Kune Do.
Mm. Okay.
And then if you see them, it's essentially there are a couple movements that techniques that would have come from Jeet Kune Do, in particular the straight blast, which we modified to more of a boxing blast.
Mm.
But basically, what you're looking at is MMA. And I've
Okay.
always been careful when I teach jujitsu, especially to make sure I give credit to my coaches. And my main coach, of course, I need to make sure I mention this, is Chris Howder, who's been the one that gave me my black belt, one of the original American coaches.
Mm.
And then the people who first exposed me to it, men like Hickson and Fabio Santos that I mentioned. But
Mm.
when Hickson first gave me permission to teach, which was before I had the privilege of meeting Chris, the one thing he asked is he said, don't call it anything else. Make sure you call it Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. So I
Mm.
titled that series Functional Jeet Kune Do because I was trying to speak to that community,
Sure. Yeah.
because that's where I'd come from, and that's what I felt comfortable talking about, and that's kind of where just a lot of the language and what I was using was tied in with that community.
Right. Right.
But when I actually get down and say, okay, we're going to work on the ground, I'm saying, when you want to learn ground fighting, you need to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. This is from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and this is from my instructor,
Hmm.
Chris Howder or Hickson, and give credit where credit is due that way. I think that's very important.
Right. Yeah, that's actually why I wanted to ask because I did not see that video, and just before I interviewed, like some hours before, somebody wrote me that you should connect with Matt Thornton because he made functional Jeet Kune. For me, there was this question like, well, I tried to functionalize Aikido for a year, and eventually I came to the conclusion, which we spoke already about. It just doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't really make sense. It's not fair. It's still in that narrow box of wanting to prove things rather than really picking up the best things which are out there.
Right.
And I was just wondering, so did it
I
really?
understand I understand your question now, and you're right, and I'm glad to hear you say that because I've seen people go through that pursuit of trying to functionalize Aikido or trying to functionalize Wing Chun, and it's always a bit quixotic because in the end, what you're going to end up with is what we're doing anyway. You're
Right,
going to end up doing some form of MMA.
right, right, right.
So, as far as the Jeet Kune Do term, let me explain it a little bit better in a slightly different way.
Yeah,
To this day, I believe that what we do at SBG is Jeet Kune Do
right,
in the sense of it is what Bruce Lee advocated for.
right,
And
right,
I think what Bruce Lee advocated for in his writing and what you hear him talking about is what we do at SBG.
right,
And so I actually do think we do functional Jeet Kune Do. Having
right,
said all that,
yeah,
it's not what you're going to find in most of the rest of the Jeet Kune Do community who's still
right,
doing hand trapping from Wing Chun and silat sweeps and forms and
right,
clicking sticks together in a very impractical way. So,
right, right, right.
but that's why I don't use that term really anymore. It's not in my advertisements. You're not going to see it at the gym. But if somebody were to ask me, "Hey, do you guys still teach Jeet Kune Do?" and
Yeah,
we do, really, you know.
yeah, nice. Could you give an advice to people who are having doubts about their martial arts, who are questioning it? Because I do meet a lot of people from my channel who have these doubts and they're just not sure what to do. How do you think they should handle that situation? Their art.
I think it's really important to go back and ask yourself, why am I training? You know,
Mm,
why am I doing this? They should ask themselves, what are they really interested in learning? What are they really interested in achieving? And if what they're really interested in achieving is something functional,
mm.
then and you come to the conclusion that what you're doing isn't functional, my advice would be let it go sooner rather than later. And
Yeah.
the sooner you let it go and you move on to something else, the happier you're going to be because
Right.
there's only so much time we have in the world. You know, it was
Mm,
interesting. Before I came on to do this interview with you, I
mm,
was watching a video that just came out of
mm.
Hickson Gracie teaching a scissor sweep.
Okay.
A scissor sweep is one of the first movements I ever learned in jiu-jitsu. So I
Yeah.
learned that in like 1992 or some whatever it
Yeah.
was, and I've been teaching it for 25 years.
Yeah.
And yet there's a detail on there that he showed that I had never understood before. That's what I love about jujitsu, and that
Yeah.
there's the depth of it. And then I think to myself how little time I have. That by the time I eventually die, and that'll be when I stop doing jujitsu. But when that day happens, how much there would have been left.
Mm.
So what time really do I have to waste on something that's not functional?
Yeah.
I
Right.
want I want what little time I have that's not spent with my family and my loved ones, where I'm
Mm.
doing my martial arts. I want to make that time value. I want to make that's precious time to me. I want to make as much use of that time as possible. So if that's how they feel about their
Mm.
life and their martial art, then I would suggest let go of what you're doing sooner
Mm.
rather than later.